Beyond the Blitzkrieg, the logistics that defined Hitler's war promises to pull back the curtain on one of the most brutal conflicts in human memory. But have you ever considered why you're so compelled to look? Is it merely curiosity, or is there a deeper, unspoken fear that even the greatest, most formidable plans can crumble from within, leaving us vulnerable despite our perceived strength? For decades, the image of the Blitzkrieg has dominated our understanding of Nazi Germany's early war machine. Lightning-fast armored divisions, coordinated air support, overwhelming force sweeping across Europe. It conjures an image of unstoppable might, a vision of technological and tactical superiority that seemed almost magical in its effectiveness. But beneath that gleaming, terrifying surface of rapid conquest lay a labyrinth of logistical challenges, a constant, grinding struggle that ultimately defined the war's true trajectory far more than any spectacular breakthrough. Hitler's grand visions consistently outstripped his nation's actual capacity, creating a critical imbalance that would prove fatal. Imagine building a magnificent high-performance race car, pouring all your resources into its engine and aerodynamics, only to realize you've forgotten to design a fuel tank large enough for the entire race, or even worse, that you don't have access to the right kind of fuel. This was, in essence, Germany's strategic dilemma. Their initial successes were breathtaking, yes, but they were built on a foundation of logistical improvisation and a fundamental underestimation of the sheer scale of modern warfare. The very speed of the Blitzkrieg, its greatest strength, quickly became its most profound weakness as supply lines stretched to their breaking point. Consider the German army's reliance on horses. While often overshadowed by tanks and Stukas, horses were the unsung, and often suffering backbone of the Wehrmacht's logistics, especially in the early years. Germany started World War II with approximately 2.7 million horses, and by 1941, over 750,000 were serving on the Eastern Front alone, pulling artillery, wagons, and supplies. This wasn't some quaint historical quirk. It was a stark indicator of an industrial nation grappling with immense transportation deficits, a fundamental vulnerability masked by initial battlefield victories. The sheer number needed for transport in the vast plains of Eastern Europe was astronomical, and their care, feeding, and replacement became a massive drain on resources and manpower, particularly as the brutal Russian winter set in. The problem wasn't just about horses. It extended to every single aspect of supply. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, medical supplies. All had to travel thousands of miles, often over roads that barely qualified as such, through hostile territory, and under the constant threat of enemy action. Germany's industrial base, though formidable, was never truly geared for a prolonged, multi-front global conflict, especially one that demanded such a ravenous appetite for resources. Their pre-war planning, focused on short, decisive campaigns, completely failed to account for the immense and sustained logistical effort required for a multi-year war of attrition. The conquest of France, a mere 6 weeks of lightning warfare, left the German logistical apparatus gasping for breath. Yet the strategic planners immediately looked east, towards the Soviet Union. This was Operation Barbarossa, a gamble of truly epic proportions, intended to crush the USSR in another quick, decisive campaign. But the scale of the Soviet Union dwarfed anything Germany had encountered before. Its vast distances, harsh climate, and underdeveloped infrastructure presented a logistical nightmare that would ultimately prove insurmountable. The initial pushes were again shockingly effective, but the further the panzers advanced, the more precarious their situation became. One of the most critical choke points was fuel. Germany was notoriously poor in natural oil reserves, relying heavily on synthetic fuel production and imports, primarily from Romania. As the war progressed, and particularly once the invasion of the Soviet Union began, the demand for fuel became insatiable. Tanks, trucks, aircraft, every aspect of the modern military ran on oil. The famous German panzer divisions, symbols of cutting-edge warfare, could only operate if they were constantly resupplied with thousands of gallons of gasoline and diesel. Capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus was a primary strategic objective for Hitler, not out of greed for territory, but out of a desperate, gnawing need to feed his war machine. Without that oil, the Blitzkrieg was literally a non-starter. Imagine the chaos on those eastern roads, mud-choked in spring and autumn, frozen solid in winter. Thousands of trucks, many captured from conquered nations, often breaking down due to lack of spare parts, creating bottlenecks that stretched for miles. Infantry marched for days, weeks on end, their boots wearing thin, their morale plummeting as the promise of a swift victory faded into the endless horizons of the Russian steppe. The German railway system, efficient within its own borders, struggled immensely with the different track gauges of the Soviet Union, requiring laborious and time-consuming transfers of supplies, or even entire track conversions, further slowing down the flow of vital materials to the front. This logistical bottleneck fundamentally limited how deep German forces could penetrate and how long they could sustain operations. Then came the brutal Russian winter of 1941–42. The Germans, expecting a quick victory, were utterly unprepared. Troops froze to death in their summer uniforms. Weapons seized up. Lubricants turned to jelly. Engines couldn't start. Ammunition wouldn't fire. The logistical system, already strained, collapsed under the weight of extreme weather conditions and the sheer volume of winter clothing, specialized equipment, and anti-freeze that was suddenly and desperately needed. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a profound logistical failure, demonstrating a catastrophic lack of foresight at the highest levels of command. The constant drain on resources also had a severe impact on German industry back home. While Allied bombing campaigns certainly played a role later in the war, the inherent limitations of Germany's own economy and its inability to simultaneously support a massive war effort while maintaining civilian production were critical. Every soldier, every bullet, every tank required raw materials, labor, and transport. As the war dragged on, these demands escalated, leading to shortages not just at the front, but within Germany itself. The sheer volume of material required for sustained modern warfare was simply beyond Germany's capacity to produce and deliver on a continental scale, particularly against adversaries with vastly greater industrial might like the United States and the Soviet Union. So, while the Blitzkrieg presented a terrifying facade of invincibility, the reality was a constant, desperate scramble for resources, a frantic effort to bridge the ever-widening gap between strategic ambition and logistical capability. Hitler's disregard for practical constraints, his belief that sheer willpower could overcome material shortages, was ultimately his undoing. The story of World War II from Germany's perspective isn't just about battles and generals. It's a profound lesson in the often overlooked, yet utterly indispensable, power of logistics. It reveals that even the most formidable military can be crippled not by direct defeat, but by the slow, inexorable grinding down of its ability to move, to resupply, and to sustain itself, proving that truly great power isn't just about the punch, but about the stamina to keep fighting. This constant, unseen battle behind the front lines was where the war was truly won and lost, a stark reminder that the most ambitious plans will always crash against the immovable wall of reality if the mundane, yet essential, details are ignored. This constant, unseen battle behind the front lines was where the war was truly won and lost, a stark reminder that the most ambitious plans will always crash against the immovable wall of reality if the mundane, yet essential, details are ignored. And nowhere was this reality more brutally apparent than in the strategic decisions made, or rather avoided regarding resource allocation. Germany, under Hitler, operated under a fundamental illusion of infinite resources, often prioritizing offensive weaponry and grandiose projects over the bedrock necessities of a sustainable war economy. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect turned Minister of Armaments and War Production, inherited a system riddled with inefficiencies and competing interests. While he managed to significantly boost armaments production in the later years, even he couldn't conjure raw materials out of thin air or fundamentally alter Germany's geographical disadvantages. The U-boat campaign, for example, devoured vast quantities of steel, fuel, and skilled labor, yet it failed to decisively cut off Allied supply lines, ultimately becoming another massive drain on finite resources without delivering a decisive strategic advantage. Each U-boat launched with steel that could have been used for tanks, locomotives that could have hauled supplies, or fuel that could have powered the beleaguered Eastern Front. The very concept of a total war was embraced by the Nazi regime, but their planning, even under Speer, remained a patchwork of desperate improvisation rather than a cohesive, long-term strategy built on realistic logistical assessments. The relentless pressure on Germany's logistical network also profoundly impacted its ability to innovate and adapt. While German engineering was renowned, the constant need for immediate battlefield solutions often trumped long-term development. Spare parts, for instance, became a chronic issue. The highly specialized nature of German machinery, from Panther tanks to Messerschmitt fighters, meant that when a critical component failed, it often couldn't be easily replaced in the field. Unlike the Allies, who often designed for mass production and interchangeability, German production focused on technical superiority, leading to complex designs that were harder to repair and maintain under combat conditions. Imagine a single tank immobilized for want of a specific bolt, thousands of miles from the factory that produced it, while the enemy closes in. Multiply that scenario across hundreds of thousands of vehicles, weapons, and aircraft, and you begin to grasp the sheer operational paralysis this caused. Maintenance crews, themselves often lacking proper tools and training, became overwhelmed, turning vast tracts of captured territory into graveyards of broken-down machinery that could not be recovered or repaired. The economic blockade enforced by the Allied powers further tightened the noose around Germany's neck. While not a direct logistical failure of the Wehrmacht, it exacerbated every existing problem. Access to critical resources like rubber, tungsten, and various rare earth metals, essential for modern warfare, was severely curtailed. This forced Germany into a scramble for synthetic alternatives, often energy-intensive and less effective, or into desperate resource extraction from conquered territories, which further strained their already overstretched transportation networks. The dream of a self-sufficient Greater German Reich was always a fantasy, a cruel joke played by geography and the realities of a globalized economy. They needed access to global resources, and when that access was denied, their advanced war machine began to choke. Ultimately, the logistical failures of Nazi Germany were not merely a footnote in their defeat. They were foundational to it. From the frozen plains of Russia to the blistering deserts of North Africa, from the bombing raids over the fatherland to the Atlantic convoys, the invisible hand of logistics was always at play. It was the lack of fuel that stalled the panzers at the gates of Moscow, the inadequate supply lines that doomed Rommel's Afrika Korps, and the crippling shortage of transport that hampered the defense of the Western Front. Hitler's strategic vision was grandiose, his tactical execution often brilliant, but his fundamental disregard for the mundane, yet absolutely critical science of supplying a modern army across an entire continent ultimately rendered all his other efforts futile. The story of Nazi Germany's war is a stark, almost cautionary tale. That even the most formidable military might can be undone not by a single heroic stand or a decisive battle, but by the slow, grinding, and inevitable failure to move the right thing to the right place at the right time. It is a testament to the fact that wars are not just won on the battlefield, but in the factories, on the railways, and in the meticulous planning of those who understand that logistics is not just a supporting role but the main act itself.